So thank you. Thank you for that beautiful song. It was very, very uplifting. So I'm very happy to be with you all today. And today, tomorrow, and on Sunday evening. So 3 days. And this time, of course, still on Zoom. My hope is that things will improve going ahead. And maybe the next time we meet, we could meet in person. So what I hope to do in these 3 times we will meet is to share with you briefly a few selections from this very ancient text called the Vivekachudamani. Many of you may have already heard this name. It's among the Vedanta books. This is among the more well-known of Vedanta texts. It is attributed to Sri Adi Shankara, who lived in the 8th century. And Adi Shankara is also seen as one of the most prominent proponents of the Advaita philosophy of non-dualism. One of the things that might be helpful to say at the outset is that while it is helpful to understand the different darshanas, the different philosophical divisions in the tradition, as broadly speaking, Advaita, non-dualism, Dvaita, dualism, and Vishishtadvaita, the qualified non-dualism. Having said that, it's also helpful to not categorize them as indivisible or rather sectioning them into like different parts of life. As we learn from Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, and Swamiji's life and teachings, that all of us pass through these 3 states. So let us not box ourselves into thinking, oh, I'm not a non-dualist, or I'm not this, or I'm not that. What we learn from Sri Ramakrishna's teachings is that for most of us, our spiritual life begins, no matter what philosophy inspires us. In the beginning, we are kind of dualists in the sense that we see that our own being, our own identity, who we are, and what that higher ideal is, who God is, they do appear as 2 different entities. And that's okay, but that's how we begin. That's how as children, when we say, we pray, we look up, we go to the mandir, all that is very valid, all that is important. But we also find that when our love and devotion deepens, then we don't see God or our Ishta as completely separate from us. There is a bond of love, a bond of bhakti, a bond of devotion which connects the Ishvara and the Jiva. And that kind of a connection is what really often then gets classified as Vishishtadvaita, in the sense that we feel we are a part of a larger whole, that God is this all-encompassing reality, and we are just a part of that infinite reality. We belong to God. We live in God. And then when that love deepens even more, as Sri Ramakrishna said, love leads to unity. Knowledge leads to unity, and love and knowledge therefore become one in the end. And so therefore, when it leads to unity, in that intensified love, our own identity doesn't remain distinct. And that doesn't necessarily happen only in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Of course, it happens that time. But even before that, you will see that even when you're doing puja, when you're doing worship, in the beginning, when we do puja, we may be aware, I'm not doing the puja of the deity who is on the altar. But when you become immersed in puja, if you are able to remain completely immersed in puja, your heart is filled with love, then that I am now doing puja, that sense goes away. All that you're thinking of is the deity on the altar. So you are really thinking of only the one, and that one is the divine. So even in the act of puja, even when we are meditating, for instance, when will we say our meditation is good or successful? If all the time during when I'm doing japa or meditation, if all the time I'm aware, I'm doing japa now, I'm doing japa, then really you're not thinking of your ishta at all. You're just like, I'm doing japa. But when you begin to think of your ishta, visualizing your ishta and repeating the mantra, that I am the one who is repeating, I am the one, that I goes away, goes in the background. And then only the ishta remains. So even while doing japa and meditation, that one remains, that's all. So dualism does get transcended even in apparently very devotional acts, which we might sometimes mistakenly dismiss as very dualistic things. So let us not make these kind of very artificial boundaries between dualism, non-dualism, and so on. Having said that, what I hope to do, it's a big book, Vivekachudamani. It is about 580 verses. So that's little smaller than the Gita. The Gita is about 700 verses. Now, covering all these close to 600 verses in 3 classes, obviously not possible. So what my plan is to kind of give you a very brief idea of the outline of the book, point out some of the important verses in it, so that you might feel then encouraged to look at the entire text and study it on its own. My interest in Vivekachudamani right now is kind of become more uppermost in my mind right now, because that's the book that I recently translated. It's called Looking Deeply. That's the title of the book. I believe some of you may have copies of that. The word Vivekachudamani, Viveka, you'll find in some of the older translations, the word Viveka often gets translated as a discrimination, which is it's not a bad word. Unfortunately, in our common conversations, the word Vivekachudamani, the word discrimination, also has a somewhat negative connotation. So don't discriminate. Discrimination is bad. And here we're saying discriminate. So it kind of creates a little bit of a tension, because in common discourse, we don't use the word discrimination always in a very positive way. And therefore, a better way, although a word that is not commonly used, is discernment. And discernment really means to look very carefully, to look deeply, so that we understand what is what. So as we will see, that is the first major requirement in spiritual life, and especially in the study of Vedanta. And Chuda means just the top, and Chudamani, the jewel, the crest jewel of discernment. In fact, many of the earlier translations of the book have been translated as, the title is translated as the crest jewel of discrimination. But the idea is, if that sounds too heavy, it simply means looking deeply. I must not be a superficial person. Whatever I do in life, I must do it intensely, with focus, with concentration, with love, with devotion. So the book itself may be broadly divided at least into 3 parts or 3 sections. The first part is the preparation. And that's important. If you're going on a long journey, the first thing, even a short journey for that matter, we need to be prepared for it. So the first thing is preparation. The second is, the book discusses the distinction between the self and the non-self. The word for self is Atma. The word for non-self is Anatma. Just the prefix an adding before Atma makes it Anatma. So the distinction between Atma and Anatma. What is Atma? What is Anatma? And the third and the final part is really to look deeply and to distinguish between these two. Right now, the two have kind of gotten mixed up. And if we only look deeply, and one of the ways to understand that is, if we kind of, now when I look out of the window, still there is quite a bright light here, and there's a river flowing, and there's lots of trees. So from a distance now, you look at a tree, of course, you will see a tree. But then you go closer, then you will be able to make out the distinctions there. You'll be able to see the branches, you'll be able to see the leaves, you'll be able to see the flowers and fruits. If you go still closer and look at it more deeply, you might even find some insects on the plants. So the idea is, the more deeply I look at something, then the finer nuances, the subtler details become clear to me. And of course, if you take a powerful microscope, then you are looking even more deeply. Then you might see things you cannot see with the naked eye. Similarly, if we look at our own selves and say, just if I simply look at myself, I just see I'm a human being. But then I look deeply, I might find more subtler realities in my heart. And that's why the title of the book is Looking Deeply. So what we will do today is just see the first part, the preparation. What we will do tomorrow is to take a look at what is this personality of mine composed of. When I say I, what is this I constituted? And then when we see on the Sunday evening, we'll say, if I look deeply at me, do I see something different in me than what I see in a very superficial way? So this is broadly how we will divide our study in this study of the Vivekachudamani. So one of the verses I would like to draw your attention to, which is often quoted verse, is look at the verse number 3. If you have copies of the book near you, it's a beautiful verse. It goes like this: Durlabham trayame vaitat devanugraha haitukam manushyatvam mumukshutvam mahapurusha samshrayaha. The following three are rare and are acquired only through God's grace: a human birth, an intense desire to be free, and the guidance of a great soul. One of the things we have to guard against in life as devotees is complacency. By complacency, I mean to not recognize how blessed we are. What this verse points out is, these are the three very rare blessings which come only through the grace of God. The human birth, we are all human beings. Desire for liberation, desire, this kind of interest and longing in spiritual life, which makes you now attend retreats like this, makes you have a spiritual practice of your own, because whichever way you determine the ultimate goal of life, you are seeking something which is higher, something which is more transcendent. Because those who do not have such a higher ideal or higher goal, just think about them. What are they really looking for? Many people we might find around us are just looking, I want a promotion, I want more money, I want more recognition, I want this, I want that. And all of these things that people seek can vanish in a moment. In fact, every night they already vanish. When you go to sleep, all of these things, as long as you're asleep, have already gone. Of course, they somehow seem to come back again the following day. So there seems to have some kind of a persistence, some kind of a continuity to these things. But we know, all of us are adults here, we know that theoretically, any of us can be dropped dead any moment. It doesn't matter whether we are healthy or not. When the time comes, we go. And when we go, all of these things that we value in this perishable world, they all simply go away, disappear. Whether you have attained that or not, they simply disappear. Then the question comes, when all of this goes away, does anything remain? And those of us who try to seek that unknown thing that we aspire for after the inevitable end comes, that is mumukshutvam, longing. We may not always necessarily, of course, people sometimes mechanically say, oh, my goal is moksha. It's not just about, as I said earlier, it's not about what we say, but deep down to recognize that there is more to life than our just day-to-day taking care of things. Life has a much deeper purpose behind it. So if that awareness has come in our heart, then we are already very blessed, because we will see we are a very small minority in the world. That there are people who are religious. Most people are good. The really bad people are actually fewer in number, thank God. But the goodness of people often tends to be rather passive. That is, they're good. Not everybody goes on killing others. That's okay. But people who are really seeking something higher, something deeper, is always going to be a very small number. And therefore, those of us who have that longing for a spiritual attainment should be grateful that we belong to a very small minority in the world. And finally, the Mahapurusha Samshrayaha. If we have been fortunate to be in touch, in contact, to receive the guidance from an enlightened being, from a Mahapurusha, from a guru in our life, then even we are more blessed. Because again, not everyone has that kind of an opportunity. So if all of these three have come in our life, in whatever measure, we should not miss this chance, because this kind of a combination may not come again. Sometimes they say 84 billion, trillion, whatever way number, sometimes given in books, that there are so many different species. When we die and when we are reborn, we can be reborn in any body. We don't have to necessarily come back as human beings. We can come back even as an ant. We can come back as a small bacteria somewhere. So the possibilities are many, and therefore think about the probability of being born again as a human being is very rare. And so it's possible that we may be reborn as human beings, but we that time may not have any longing for God. It's possible that we may have longing for God. We may not have an opportunity to learn about spiritual life from an enlightened being. Now, if all of those three have come together in our life, then Shankara says in this book in the beginning, not making the best use of this opportunity, that is real suicide. So real atmaha, that's the word that is used here. So spiritual suicide means having had all these opportunities, I do not make the best use of them. Look at verse number 6. It's on page 15, the book. Pathantu shastrani yajantu devan kurvantu karmani bhajantu devataha atmaikya bodhena vina vimuktihi nasiddhyati brahma shatantarepi. People may study scriptures, sacrifice to the gods, do work, and worship the deities. But without experiencing oneness with Atman, spiritual freedom cannot be achieved, even in a span that equals hundreds of Brahma's lifetimes. Now, what this means is that all of the spiritual practices that we do, they are helpful, but they are helpful only to the extent they lead me to the experience of the truth in my heart. God cannot be purchased. You cannot say, oh, every day I'm doing so much japa, so God has to appear before me. There's no option. Or every day I'm doing so much puja, or I've done so much pilgrimage. None of those things are going to be enough. All of those things can be useful if I do it in a proper spirit. But ultimately, the goal of spiritual life is to transform my heart. I should feel that I'm a better person now than what I was 6 months ago, or a year ago, or 5 years ago. Because sometimes we might think, oh, I'm doing japa for so many years, I've been doing puja so much, and I've done this, I've done that. But ultimately, if nothing has changed in my heart, if the same selfishness, anger, hatred, fear, suspicion, if all of these negativities are still present in my heart, then what's the point? Then that japa and meditation haven't really done good at all. So one of the ways we can test whether our spiritual life is going in the right direction, whether we are not just wasting our time, is to not compare yourself with other people. Sometimes do that. Oh, my neighbor meditates so much and therefore I should do more. It's not about comparing ourselves with other people, but comparing ourselves with ourselves. In other words, I have to ask myself, today, am I a better person than what I was 2 years ago? And by better, I mean, have I been able to overcome or minimize at least some of the weaknesses I may have detected in my heart? If I'm prone to losing anger, then I must ask, am I still doing that? Or maybe my angry temperament has now mellowed down a bit. Am I able to remain calm in trying and difficult, challenging situations? These are the ways we can measure our spiritual progress. Not necessarily only in what kind of dreams I had or what kind of visions I had. Because sometimes people have wonderful dreams, wonderful visions, but they still continue to be as crazy as before. So they say, what's the point in all those visions then? So it's not about what you see, it's about who I am. And that's the message that comes to us from that verse, which says that the primary thing is recognizing the truth in my own heart. What I want to do now is to take a set of verses from 18 through 27, which describe the primary qualities necessary to even begin this study. Sometimes we might see that we might do everything that needs to be done, and yet we may not see the expected results, partly because we have not made ourselves ready for that effort. So these are a set of words. They are not difficult at all. So we'll first read through the whole thing, and then we will quickly see whether there are any points that need elaboration. I'll begin with verse 18. That's on page 20. Sadhananyatra chatvari katitani manishibhihi Yeshu satsveva sannishta yadabhavena siddhyati. The wise have spoken of 4 disciplines, possessing which the pursuit of Brahman succeeds, in the absence of which it fails. So these 4 disciplines in Sanskrit, they are called as sadhana chatushtaya. We may not have all these 4 in their fullest perfect measure, but we must at least be aware of them. We must have at least a little bit of each. So then, with some of these present in our heart, when we begin and continue with our spiritual practice, we will see that gradually the intensification and the fullness of all these 4 gradually grows. But this is very important to see whether these are present with me in at least a small measure at the moment. If not, then these are the things I must strive for first. Because if I get these, then attainment of God becomes easier. So the 4 are listed in the next verse, 19. Ado nitya nitya vastu vivekaha pariganyate ihamutra phalabhoga viragaha tadanantaram shamadishatka sampattir mumukshutvam iti sputam. First comes discernment, viveka, between the real and the unreal, followed by detachment, vairagya, from pleasures here and hereafter. The 6 treasures, such as restraint of the mind, samadhishat sampatti, and longing for freedom, mumukshutva. Pleasures here and hereafter. Here means right now, in this life, in this world. Hereafter means pleasures after this world. That many people see that going to Swarga is the goal of life, because then you can have even more pleasures there. You can, if you like drinking, then you got somarasa there, and there's lots of food, and all those things are kind of described in books. There's this one small story some of you may have heard, that there was this one very elderly couple in their maybe 80s or 90s. They were very good people, and they both died a few days apart from each other. And so as these stories go, they approach the pearly gate, the gates to heaven, when St. Peter opens the door and says, welcome, and shows them their apartment in heaven. And they're very happy to see. It's a very beautiful, much better apartment than the one they had on this earth. And they are looking like, where is the kitchen? And St. Peter said, no, you don't have to cook anything here. He shows them another one, big room where all kinds of foods, whatever kind of food you want, everything is available. And he says, this food here is available 24 hours a day. Whenever you want, you can eat. And this is heaven. Everything you eat will be digested. There'll be no health issues at all. Eat whatever you want, as much as you want. As soon as he tells that, this man he takes out his hat, who had gone from the earth, and throws it onto the ground and starts cursing and yelling at his wife. And everybody's like confused. You should be happy now you're in heaven. Why are you so mad? And then this husband is telling that wife, but for these bran muffins, I could have come to this wonderful place 20 years ago. So sometimes we might think, eating health foods and prolonging our life here, we could be in a much better place. Now, what Vedanta teachers often say is that is only an illusion. Because if we look deeply at heaven, then we will see that in our Puranas, they speak about Dhanvantari. Some of you may have heard. Dhanvantari are said to be the physicians of the gods. And you say, why would God need physicians? Well, that means there is illness and disease there also. Otherwise, what is the Dhanvantari job there? And so therefore, if you look deeply in heaven, go a little bit closer and see, oh no, it's not simply all fun. If you eat too much and if you don't restrain yourself, then you can fall ill and you'll need dhanvantari. There are also dangers there. We so much throughout our books, we'll see the fighting between devas and the rakshasas. How often these rakshasas go and attack the devas. Indra feels threatened, runs to Mahavishnu for help. It's not like they all sleep very peacefully there. So the fear of losing power, the fear of enemies coming, in other words, everything that is present on this earth is present in heaven also. So not much of a difference. I mean, think about it this way. When someone from an extremely backward or poor or undeveloped part of the world comes to America or comes to some very developed nation, their first impression is going to be, oh my God, this is heaven. I didn't have running hot water in my country. It is here. This is this. So you just feel it's heaven. And then you live for a few days and a month and a year, and they say, oh no, even in this kind of heavenly place, there are problems. And if there were poor people back home in my poor little country, well, there are poor people here also. If there were homeless there are homeless here. In other words, slowly we see that what appeared at heaven at one time has the same kind of problems we had before. That is the kind of experience we will have when we go to heaven. And therefore, heaven as an ideal, as a goal to go to, is rejected in Vedanta. Vedanta says what we want is something permanent, and heavens are not permanent. The Gita also says, A Brahma Bhuvana Lokaha Punaravartino Arjuna. No matter where you go, Gandharva Loka, Surya Loka, Chandra Loka, Brahma Loka, whichever Loka you go, afterwards you have to come back here. So nothing is permanent. The only thing, if you want something which will never end, then you have to know the truth in your heart. So spiritual seekers don't aspire to go to heaven. They aspire to experience the presence of God in the heart, because only that will remove all suffering permanently. Only that will bring us that extreme joy forever. And then the subsequent verses now will give us what these four disciplines are. I won't read the Sanskrit now, I'll just read the English part. Beginning with verse 20. The example of discernment between the real and the unreal is the firm conviction that Brahman is real and the world is an appearance. Detachment is aversion to seeing and hearing, etc., of the ephemeral objects of enjoyment, ranging from one's own body to the celestial world of Brahma. That's what I said just now. Even Brahmaloka is just perishable. And therefore, one doesn't feel attached to that. Restraining the mind, shama, means dwelling steadily on one's goal after repeated detachment from the multitude of sense objects by observing their defects. The only way we can, if you're attached to something, how do we create detachment from something we are attached to? For instance, now sometimes people who are very accustomed to eating sweets and the blood sugar level goes very high, the doctor says, stop eating sweets. We'll say, but I love sweets, I enjoy sweets. And every time I see a rasagulla or a good sandesh, my hand automatically goes forward. What will I do? And then the only way I can stop that is I look and ask myself, now when I eat this rasagulla, as long as it is on my tongue, as long as it's up to this part of my body, maybe I'm enjoying the taste and feeling good about it. Once it goes beyond this level, there's nothing, no more taste, nothing, just hard work afterwards. And if that is going to go and that sugar is going to go and into my system, and then what are the kind of problems people who are diabetic experience potentially? What are the harmful effects of that? What are the kind of complications it can create? The more I see the defects, the less, next time someone brings rasagulla, I will just see, oh, these are the, I remember a few years ago, well, quite some years ago, actually. When I was in Chennai, before I came to this country. So we were sitting for lunch in our ashrama there. And then one Swami was sitting next to me. And so we, as in many of our Indian centers we do, and pretty much everywhere here also, oftentimes on the table or wherever you're sitting, you have containers containing salt and pepper or things like that. So if anyone wants to add more salt, they can add. So there was this small container with salt. And so the Swami next to me wanted more salt. And so he asked me, could you please pass that salt? So I passed it to him. And as I was giving it to me, he looks at it and says, this is nothing but blood pressure. So, I mean, salt is, of course, we need a little bit of salt for taste. But now if doctor has told me, don't eat too much salt, your BP is high. Then one way would be, every time I look at the salt and say, this is nothing but high blood pressure. If I make that kind of a mental connection, then I'll not feel like taking, I'm not saying everybody has to do that, but if my doctor has said that's not good for me, then I can do that. So best way to detach ourselves is to look deeply and find the defects in that. Restraining the senses, Dhamma, means withdrawing both the types of senses from their objects and returning them back to their respective abodes. The best state of withdrawal, uparati, occurs when a thought wave of the mind is without any external support. Verse 24, bearing all suffering without resistance, anxiety and grumbling is called forbearance, titiksha. Holy Mother, as we know, stressed this very much. How forbearance, to forbear the ups and downs of life without complaining, without grumbling, without resisting, without anxiety, can build up our inner strength. And that is absolutely important in spiritual life. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have to protect yourself. It's not like, oh, it's a very harsh winter, I'm not going to put warm clothes, I'm not going to grumble about it. No, you don't have to do that. Do whatever needs to be done, necessary to protect yourself. But in spite of doing your best, if there are still certain adverse circumstances outside, then bear them bravely, without complaining, without that. Because only then can we keep our mind calm. And only if our mind is calm, then we can use it for prayer, meditation, or whatever other work we need to do. But if our mind is agitated and disturbed and always complaining or depressed or whatever, then we become incapable of doing what needs to be done. And that's why forbearance is an important spiritual practice. Verse 25, the wise say that faith, by means of which the real is attained, means accepting as authentic the words of the scripture and of one's teacher. Verse 26, contentment does not mean pampering the mind, but directing it fully toward the pure Brahman. Verse 27, the longing for freedom is the desire to be free from the bondage of ignorance, meaning the body and the ego, etc., by knowing one's own true nature. How intensely Sri Ramakrishna used a beautiful word. He called it vyakulata, that intense longing. And that Sri Ramakrishna says that if I can cry, he said, people shed so many tears for things of this world. Who wants to weep for God? If tears come out of love for God, even for 3 days we are in that state, we will realize God. So that is how much stress he gave on the intensity of our love, the intensity of our desire to realize God. And therefore, mumukshutva is important. And what is the height of that longing? What would be the uppermost point to that longing? There is a book called the Vedanta Sara. It has this beautiful phrase, I love it very much. And it says, Deepta Shira Jalarashim iva. Suppose someone's head is on fire. What will that person want at that time? That person will say, I just want to go and dip my head in some water so that this fire can be put out. Now, while this person's head is on fire and searching for water, someone says, why don't you have a little rasagulla first and then you can take water? He said, no, I don't want anything. I first want to remove this fire. So if that kind of intensity comes in our heart, I want to realize God. Everything else is secondary. That is the most important thing. We don't even need to do any other spiritual practice. That intensity itself will take us to that highest truth. So all of the other practices that we do is somehow to clarify in our own head the importance of realizing God. So this is the kind of a broad picture of the kind of preparations we need to have. Since you already have the books, I would encourage you to kind of read these verses carefully. Today we just went kind of raced through them because of shortage of time, but read through them a bit carefully and then think about it. But right now, what I will do is